Hi, I'm Chance.
And I'm Sarah Catherine.
And this is Conservation Connection. We run a wildlife education nonprofit focused on connecting students to their environment.
Each week here on Conservation Connection, we do just that by introducing you to the groundbreaking science and conservation work that's happening every day around the country.
We talk to professionals in the world of conservation science and wildlife management and ask them about their career,
their current projects,
their wild and crazy stories from the field,
and everything in between.
Join us each week to discover just how these dedicated people are working to protect our planet. Alrighty guys, welcome to another episode of Conservation Connection. We are very excited to be doing our first round of live podcasts. We are here in Columbus, Georgia at Scofflaw Brewing Company. You know, we podcast all across the country and we're always excited when we get to do stuff here in our hometown. So I'm even more excited to be doing a bonus episode with Sarah Tash.
Woohoo! Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
This is also, you can probably hear the difference, a live podcast episode. So live podcast audience, let's hear a round of applause.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll write you guys all checks later for your participation. We appreciate it. Cool. So we're about to do one of my very favorite things in the world, which is go into an episode with no idea about what we're going to talk about other than like literally a title. So, Sarah, what are we about to talk about?
We are going to talk about pollinators, specifically honeybees and bumblebees and the distinction between the two.
Awesome. So before we get into our episode du jour, can you give me just a quick introduction of who you are, where you're studying, where you're going next?
Sure. I am 6 weeks away from graduating with my master's in environmental science from Columbus State.
Awesome.
As if that wasn't terrifying enough, I start my PhD at Auburn in January.
Yay, War Eagle.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alabama fans.
We do have an Auburn grad also sitting here at the table with us. You're welcome, Caleb. Don't give me a thumbs down. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot of people say save the bees. First off, why do bees matter?
Bees are one of our greatest pollinators that we've got for biodiversity on the planet. And if you like food, especially anything that grows specifically with a flower, so watermelon, tomatoes, and those are things that you really enjoy, all of those foods are capable because of our native pollinators. And bumblebees are our greatest asset in that. And so I think when we talk about save the bees, the immediate thing is to think of the cute honeybee and all the wonderful things that they produce for us, honey. But they are actually kind of down on the scale of our more efficient pollinators and are in perfectly content numbers because they are a semi-domesticated animal. We actually keep them like we do sheep or cows. And our native bumblebees are really the bees that are in the most trouble in terms of their numbers in the wild.
Absolutely.
Random question, but applicable because this is what the podcast is about. Can you also keep native bees?
You can attempt to help your native bees. You'll see lots of people putting up solitary bee houses in their backyards for things like mason bees or leafcutter bees. But really the best way to aid our native bumblebees is just alter how we think about our backyards and our natural spaces, because they do hibernate over winter. So the way we care for them is significantly different than a honeybee.
So what are some things that your average everyday American can do to help support our native pollinators and make sure that they have a good place to, say, hibernate?
Absolutely. So leaving those wild spaces in your yards or adjacent to your yards is super important. I know we live in a society where clean-cut lawns and no leaves is the norm, but leaving those leaves down on the ground, leaving the twigs and the areas up against our forested sections or along our highways, those are the places that they're going to pick to overwinter. And it's so important that they have those safe spaces because they overwinter alone, not within a colony. It's a solitary single queen bee all by herself waiting to come out in the spring.
So really it boils down to complexity, right? So
Absolutely.
we love Nathan Pyle, who writes, Strange Planet? It's aliens talking about human things like they're alien things, right? He's got a great comic where he's like, welcome to my home. I have put all of my things with strange shapes into boxes with straight lines so that you might imagine that I don't have strange shaped things in my home. We as humans really like that kind of really clean cut, nature doesn't build in straight lines thing. But it's that complexity. It's the leaves on the ground. It's not just one type of leaf, but multiple different species. It's different species that are growing in your lawn that have the time between trimmings to grow and produce seeds and produce significant amount of complexity structurally and biologically that really helps support these species, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think when we think about ecology, it just needs to be a web. You think, well, it's just one species. How much can it impact if one thing goes extinct? But that one thing is such an integral link and such a larger, significant picture that we really need to start thinking about biology as ecology. And each individual species is so important to the overall health of everything all together. And if we start thinking about biodiversity and ecology that way, we may have a better way of saving the things on the planet.
Absolutely.
So getting into kind of a more personal note, what made you care about bees? Because I know a bunch of kids, I had a bunch of friends when I was a kid that you saw a bee and you're like, no, get away from me. So have you always loved bees? Is this something that came to you later in life? Tell us more.
So I had the great pleasure of being a graduate assistant at Oxbow Meadows the first year of grad school with Dr. Densau and Dr. Lauren Johnson. And they offer a beekeeping class through Chattahoochee Valley Beekeepers Association. And I was like, well, okay, that sounds great. Let's do that. It's a 6-week class every Saturday. And my husband and I took it together. And by the end, the kitchen is full of bee items. And now there's a whole garage full of honeybee stuff. And I'm unbelievably fascinated by the societal structure, how they function, and that interest kind of boiled over into native bees.
Which is a really interesting point to reach here, where we talk about native bees, right? Which there are, do you know how many species of bees are native to Georgia or to the Southeast?
Yeah, we've got.
Of course she knows.
Of course I know. 47, roughly, 7 are which are well within the category of either vulnerable or several that are critically endangered now, to the point that we are very concerned that we'll lose them in the next decade.
So when I think of bee, I picture a single species, basically, your standard European honeybee,
yep.
Right? Which is the semi-domesticated species that makes honey and beeswax and yada, yada, yada. And that is one of 48 species, I suppose, right? 47 native plus the European honeybee, is that right?
So the honeybee is non-native.
Right, exactly.
Yep. Yeah, we brought those over in the 1800s. So it's a non-native species. I think for our native species, the distinction is the bombus species of bumblebees, which is my favorite.
Tell me more.
Fuzzy butts, just big fuzzy butts. They're big. You can hear them coming a mile away as they come at your head. They're making such a loud noise. And that loud noise is part of the reason they're such effective pollinators. So they do something called buzz pollination, where they land within a flower and they use that vibration to release pollen stores from well deep within the flower that other pollinators can't reach. So that buzzing that you hear from bumblebees as they fly at your head is actually an incredibly effective pollination tool that only bumblebees are able to do.
They're literally shaking the pollen
of
out the reproductive structures.
They are, yeah.
And to kind of back things up here, if I was an alien and I had no idea what pollination was, can you give me pollination 101? What is it and why does it matter?
Sure. So for diversity, we need to ensure that the genetic pool of our species is as wide as we can get it. And pollination ensures that that genetic pool stays really wide and diverse. So even if you have two similar flowers and they're side by side, their genetic structure may be slightly different. And that's how evolution occurs.
In the same way that we are all Homo sapiens sapiens, but we have all wildly different groups of genetics that make up who we are as individuals.
Absolutely. That is the best analogy I think I've ever heard. Yes.
I love it when I hear that.
Yes. And so in order to keep that gene pool nice, wide, and open, we need to be able to cross-pollinate between species, like within the species, but between individuals. And so that wide gene pool is really where evolution is driven from. The smaller the gene pool, the less likely a species is to evolve out in nature. And so that continues to shrink their numbers as they can adapt.
And the kind of fundamental issue with any flowering plant species is that in order to reproduce, you have to get the male and female reproductive cells together, and plants don't walk around very well. So they rely on pollinators, which can be in a lot of times that's bees or other insect species, but it can be as diverse as monkeys, lizards, bats. There's even wind and water pollination. There's a lot of ways, but basically it's moving those pollen cells around so that seeds with different genetics can be created and grow out into the environment, right?
Absolutely. Even mammals that brush up against things, especially ones that migrate long distances, are great drivers of pollination. Those like lovely little triangles of seeds that you like get on your pants that go with you, those are seeds that get pollinated, and they attach themselves to species as they move throughout the ecosystem and then pollinate.
Plant dispersal, right, where you get your seeds and you go to different places, is it's like a huge challenge for plants, and they have risen to the occasion in so many interesting ways.
Oh, yeah.
Just hop on Wikipedia and search like plant dispersal, and you can, you may not be able to. I can 100% spend like 6 hours reading about it.
Yeah.
So good job, impressive. Everyone. You're all pollinators.
Yeah. Thank you for being pollinators.
So you mentioned something a second ago about non-native, and I feel like a lot of the times you hear like invasive species and they're so bad and all of that, but rarely do you hear like non-native and the difference between those two things. So could you tell us a little bit about what makes something non-native and not invasive?
Yeah, so an invasive species is something that moves into an area and effectively chokes out native species. So non-native plants here is like the kudzu that you see growing, and it grows over the trees, effectively choking out anything that lives underneath it. That's an invasive species. So anything that moves in and effectively pushes out a native species is an invasive species. A non-native one is something that just arrived here that doesn't naturally occur in this area. And it happens a lot more, especially now that humans have kind of dispersed across the planet. We've got new ways of travel that get us places faster. That's why when you go to islands, they make you fill out the extensive custom form to make sure you're not bringing anything that doesn't naturally occur there, that it would disrupt that biodiversity that naturally lives.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my go-to examples for like something that is not native but not invasive is spider lilies that pop up around the equinox. Equinox, is that right?
I think so.
We're going to cut this part out. That pop up, and they're actually, I think, a European or a Eurasian species that were brought over to the U.S. hundreds of years ago because they're beautiful and ornamental. But what they don't do is they don't disrupt the ecosystem that they're in.
No.
So they're not like kudzu, which is a Japanese species, which grows these amazing vines. They're very edible, by the way. You can eat kudzu if you prepare it properly. Don't sue me if you die. But the spider lilies don't disrupt the ecosystem that they're in. And that's the primary difference between something that is non-native and something that is invasive.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this impromptu episode on our native bees. And we're looking forward to interviewing you again in less than an hour here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conservation Connection.
If you enjoyed our podcast, go ahead and subscribe to make sure you catch every episode that we post.
If you've got a minute to spare, leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts helps other conservation-minded people find the show. We'd really appreciate it.
A big thanks to everyone working to protect our planet, and a big thanks to you for listening. See you next time.